Hello there, I'm making this video to show you some basics for blockout purposes, or for example if you were thinking about drawing an environment and needed a bit of perspective guidance that 3D can help us with. So if we start off, I've just opened up Unreal and I've put a new level. That's all I've got so far, so just a new project and a new level, which is under the basic tab here. So it doesn't have a terrain currently, it has this block just to get started, but not too much in the world at this point. So we could get rid of that, we don't need it if we're going to make some terrain, which I'm going to show you next. To do this, you go to landscape, and if you notice here we're on a create new here. I'm going to go through the basics of actually just setting up something quite empty, and then using a bit of very basic sculpting to kind of start to understand how that process would work to be able to develop the kind of level block out or base for concept art that you're after. So you've got this create new part here. If we leave it as a default one, we'll click create, but of course you know you've got some selections here. You can import from file as well if you know what you're doing there. So I'm just going to keep it very simple. Go to create new, use it on the default settings and click create. So then you've got this terrain ready to go. You've got the sculpt tab that opens up automatically for you now, and we've got a sculpt brush ready to go. You can change the strength, the size and all that stuff here, but I'll just show you what you do now then. So if you do click, you notice that it starts to kind of build that up. So yeah, I think just using the basic sculpt brush for now to show you how that works, and you can press erase to kind of undo what you've done there if you need to. You can press smooth if things are looking a bit too bumpy and you want to smooth that off. Let's just get a bit more on there as well then. So let's say for example I wanted my environment to be in this area here, and I notice there's a lot going on there. Flatten's quite useful because it kind of gives you a platform to put your environment on, so you know at least then that's going to be a flat base for your objects and your buildings and things like this to go on. Ramp is also quite useful because you can set how the player will be able to navigate onto that area, for example. So if I put that quite low here, maybe I'll bring it a bit further out actually, then like this, something like this anyway. Press add ramp, and then what it'll do is it'll make sure that there is a slope, for example, that gets onto that area that you're thinking of. You're just trying to think, I suppose, about how you can actually get to these places that you're making there too. And then if you're noticing some weird things going on, you can always smooth it just so it doesn't look as obvious. Okay, so those are the very basics of what we'll be doing over this side, really, when it comes to sculpting. So remember, it is just a light environment touch at this point, because we're not expecting to do anything too crazy at this stage until we've worked out that the scale's right and that we're happy with it. So that's what we're doing with the block out. And if we're doing it for a base for concept art, you know, we're just doing it really to work out how to place everything, maybe the proportions, maybe the perspective. That will help with when we kind of work out, okay, I want it from this kind of angle, what I need to do there. Okay, so yeah, I think that will help in terms of working out how to set a terrain up, and then just think about what you actually need to show. It might be that you don't need that much to show off, so maybe you just want to have it quite close in this kind of perspective here. So then you just kind of need to work out how it's going to look like it's not just going into nothing at the back, you know. So things to kind of hide what we are showing there, so it doesn't look flat. So that's quite useful to think, like, you don't want any straight lines showing really there, otherwise it starts to look a bit, you know, you definitely made that up and it doesn't, and you're kind of like sitting in this void. So yeah, once you've got the basics of the environment, you've thought about, obviously you would spend a bit more time on it than me, but you know, trying to think about how to make it look like you need it to look like, and you know, the kind of angle that you want to view it from. Don't forget you can press Control and 1 to set an area that you can bookmark. So if you've got a few different viewpoints that you're considering, and and you're not quite sure about that yet, you could always kind of press Control 2, then you can set the second one, and you can kind of go between those two angles just to see which one you prefer. Other things to think about then, when we're taking it to blockout stage, we're trying to think about objects that are going to be in there and working out where that all goes and if it works. You've got this modelling drop down here, which I think is easier to use than using things like brushes, because these will be static meshes, so it's probably a nicer one to use. So for example, if we were going to put a box in, let's just put that back to the default. So first off, you start off with something like this, as a little box. If you want to change the height, the depth and everything, that's what you're doing on there. And then you can kind of preview it here, see if you're happy with that. So you can click it there, you can move it and you can rotate it and whatnot. When you're ready, you can press accept, and that's then your static mesh box there. So if you wanted to, you could then press Alt and duplicate it. Maybe you want a few different houses here, so and then maybe you can rotate them down. Then you might start to notice that things are quite bumpy for you. So if that's the case, you may need to think about flattening it, otherwise you're going to end up with, say, objects that are sort of like hanging out where they shouldn't be. So yeah, have a little think about that. You may need to then go back to the landscape and kind of adjust little bits here. So yeah, then you probably want to kind of bring the tool strength a bit lower, maybe the brush a bit smaller, so you've got a little bit of precision there on the go. Oops, not that one, let's go for sculpt, and then we can kind of bring that up a bit. Then you may want to flatten it as well, so it's not too jagged for an environment there. So you probably want to go a little bit back and forth, really making sure that they are actually sitting on there properly and they look about right for that world that you need. And then keep checking your viewpoint. Is that kind of right for what you need? Maybe I prefer a different viewpoint now that I started to put buildings in there, so another bookmark, so you can kind of flip between them and start to understand what you actually like to look at. So it should take a bit of time then to experiment and understand where we are with everything, if it's working for the kind of scale that you need to. It's always quite useful, if you haven't already got the third person character there, to add that in. So you can go to your content, press add, and there you can add features or contents, and then you can add something like a third person, even if your game is not meant to be third person. Or for us, we're just doing an environment here. In terms of a blockout, now we're not using it as a third person game, but a third person's quite useful to have, so you can run around and kind of check the scale, see if it looks about right. So I do recommend that you do add the third person in there and try and run around with them. It also kind of helps to understand if the scale's a bit right for the slope. So for example, if that ramp was meant to be our entrance point, can we actually walk up it comfortably, or is it kind of too... Oh no, that's fine. Yeah, so that works. It's always good to kind of check that. And then look how small my buildings are. So I haven't done that right at all. I would have probably I should have looked at the scaling really, but that's why I think testing things out is really helpful, by having a third person in there instantly. When you run up to the building, you think, well, yeah, I'm almost as big as a building. Then that it doesn't look right. So you can start to tweak those things and make sure it is what it needs to be then, and quite realistic for the scene. Okay, so we've got a paint mode on the landscape tab that we can use eventually when we do need to start applying materials. And working out which textures we want for this terrain. Now, it will require setting up a material beforehand, which allows you to choose different types of textures, so the different texture maps that you'll load into it as different brushes. So you do need to set that up first, and once you do that, you add one as your base colour, And then what it means is that you can use your different brushes to then paint. So for example, maybe at the top of the hills you want them to be a little bit icy, you'd work that out by using, like, blending in that the ice texture that you've got. Maybe some of this needs to be muddy, so you would brush in a little bit of a mud texture. Maybe the base one was grass. So you can do a lot with this. But for now, we're just looking at the block out part, so we're keeping it very, very simple. So once you are in the landscape mode, remember, you're creating a new on this tab. It jumps straight over to sculpt. You can use your different brushes over here. Have an experiment with the others too. Blueprint's a bit more complicated though, so that's going to be bringing in a map for that one. So you may want to have a look into that too if that helps for what you need. But for now, we're just keeping it as a block out kind of level. So I think on the most part, you only really need those ones that I showed you today. But do feel free to muck around with different things too. There's a lot you can do if you really spend some time here working stuff out. Finally, I just wanted to add a quick note in selection mode of, if you shift select all of your objects, you can then go to export selected, and then we've got it as an FBX type here. What it means is then we can actually save this as an FBX file type so that we can import it into something like Maya. So then you can maybe start modelling in more detail the objects that you need, and then you can kind of swap out what you've got in your block out and bring in your actual ones, but you stick into the right scale because you've already worked it out here in your block out. So that's one thing that you may want to look into. If I just save that, let me just show you real quick. Right, so if you can remember to deselect the collision, it just prevents that extra collision being sent over to your FBX and then opening in Maya, because it will look a bit weird when you open it in Maya, so it will look like you've got overlapping meshes. If you see, you might probably seen this in Maya before, where you've got sort of like, when you turn the camera, you'll notice some weird black parts appearing over your mesh. So yeah, just remember to do that before you click on export if you can.